Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, it is the end of 2021. I am sure you're all pretty much ready for it to be over. Of course, that's what everybody was saying about 2020. So, let's try and keep an open/apocalyptic mind about the year ahead. I'm trying to take it easy this week. It's that week between Christmas and New Year's. I'm only reading 2 or 3 books, recording 2 podcasts, and making more art. Plus a time-sensitive work project may have been dumped in my lap. But other than that, I'm kind of trying to treat this weird interweek as a moment to relax. So in the spirit of the whole end of year and weird interweek, I thought I'd do an episode with the most boring guest I could come up with. That way I wouldn't be wasting a good guest on a week where people, aren't around, might miss this one because they're traveling or just depressurizing or whatever, just getting away from the internet. Anyway, that boring guest is me. Over the years, I've done a couple of me-centric episodes, but unlike those, this one isn't going to be listener-submitted questions and me prattling on about them. Instead, I asked one of my best pals to interview me. His name is Aaron Finkelstein, and we've been friends since 1993 or thereabouts when we met while I was at St. John's College. Aaron, or Fink as I know him, he's always been the guy who thinks most similarly to how I think, if that makes sense. The way I put it, in my magazine editing days, I had a pretty esoteric way of working and putting everything together. Made perfect sense to me, but I realized normal people, they would not understand what my workflow was, what the process really entailed. And I used to say that Fink was the only person, if I got hit by a bus or something, who could sit down at my computer, look at the desktop, look at the folders, and understand how I made the magazine every month. I mean, I never thought about whether he'd have been able to explain that process to anyone else, but, regardless, you get what I mean. Fink and I have talked a bunch in recent months after my diagnosis, but I knew he'd be good at asking questions and not making this an inside baseball, you had to be there sort of conversation. I've talked about this a little, like when I've interviewed people who are long-term friends of mine, it's a little bit of a challenge not to fall back on the things the two of you already share, but to make it something that an audience can grok. So he did a great job of that, and also in the process, got me gabbing about things I don't typically talk about on the show, or at least not in the same way. See, because I'm the guest this time, I talked a little more digressively than usual. I let my free associations free, as it were. So this verbal Gil you're getting this episode might be a little different than the Gil who hosts the show. You can decide for yourself. Maybe I'm just being self-conscious, but it felt like I was talking a little differently than I usually do, and maybe you'll get something out of that. So, as far as caveats go, the piece of art that I talk about a few times was the Christmas card I was making for Amy. It was a watercolor of our dog Bendico. I posted it on Instagram and Twitter. The thing was, Amy was upstairs, and I didn't know if she was listening in, so I didn't want to talk too closely about what I had just made that morning. She's upstairs now, and I still don't know if she's listening in. Also, I exaggerate a little about my mental health during this episode. Don't take it seriously, although sometimes, maybe a little. And last thing, when I mentioned NBA jams, and this is the most important caveat, I was wrong. The original arcade version's Charlotte Hornets team was Larry Johnson and Kendall Gill. The console version had Alonzo Mourning. This is really important to anybody who hears that part of the show and says, Gil, you idiot, that wasn't the NBA jams that came out in the arcade. Anyway, that'll give you an idea what this conversation's going to be like. You can stop now, honestly. This is going to be almost 2 hours of me kind of gabbing with my friend Aaron. Here's Aaron's bio. Aaron Finkelstein is a writer, sound designer, and musician living in Seattle, Washington. He has, for more than a decade, played the role of trickster uncle to his young nephews, Kai and Kenji. He teaches them board games, iambic pentameter, pop music trivia, comic strip history, theoretical and applied geekery, and the power of the written word. Mr. Finkelstein has held the job titles of Coal Scuttle, Web Monkey, Don Juan's Feckless Tobacconist, Sprinting Cubicle Troglodyte, Copy Flogger, Phonics Monkey, Tritagonist, and the much-maligned Voice of Reason. Currently, he is seeking gainful employment as a Luftmensch, license plate alphabetizer, or color swatch. He no longer accepts appointments as a social creature, stagefoot, perhaps man, or peacekeeper. And now, the virtual memories conversation between Aaron Finkelstein and Gil Roth.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I know it's been a big year for a lot of reasons. I know it's been a very difficult year for a lot of reasons, as it has been for all of us. But you know, I think with the podcast getting back to the return in form, I kind of wanted to know if there's anything particular you learned or took from the experience of having to start doing them remotely. Did it change anything about your interview style? Did it change anything about the way you related to the guests as much as you thought it might? Or
it's been weird. It's and I actually counted recently because of the end of year explosion of cases again. Since getting back to recording in person, of the 30 podcasts since that first one in person, only 13 of them have been in person. So I've still done more than half of them remotely, even post-vaccine. I dig the liberation it gives me to be able to get someone who I'm not necessarily going to go to see in New York, or they're not going to get to New York or New Jersey, et cetera. So the convenience factor has been a boon. That said, there are guests who I'm very thankful, even this year, that I got to do in person as opposed to recording remotely. I'll say two right off. Peter Sheldall, the New Yorker art critic, because of the internet coverage near where he lives, he would never have been able to do remote anyway. And just being able to spend an afternoon with him was absolutely magical. And then Ed Sorel, conceivably we could have done a remote. I've seen him do Zoom interviews recently, but getting to sit down in person and then all the other stuff that went on once we were done recording, made the whole thing magical. But yeah, it's different this way. Recording with somebody I've previously recorded with, doing a remote, is okay because we know each other. We've at least got some way of vibing. The first time with somebody new can be, it can be more challenging just because I'm used to approaching people in person, making an impression and putting them at ease, where now they're sitting in front of their computer and they're worried about the technology and all this stuff. And I have to kind of ease them into all that stuff. That said, a bunch of those conversations have gone really well. There are people who I've stayed in touch with. I never want to say made friends with, because I always assume all of you forget who I am the moment, I hit stop record, but whatever. I've managed to build, good conversations and connections with people who I've only recorded with this way, which harkens back to the old days of, having a telephone and just talking like that instead of, I think people are relieved by not having to be on video. I know I am.
For sure.
Because, we're always looking at our own tile. And if we're supposed to be looking at other stuff, we're always worried about what we look like. So,
and if you've had an experience with a camera, you also know, you notice the difference between where your eye contact actually is and when you're looking even at the speaker, unless you're the right distance away from the laptop. So I'm constantly trying to remember to look directly into the camera so they feel like I'm looking at them and not looking down. So
yeah, no, when I have to do a presentation, I do text edit windows directly underneath the camera. So it's as close to looking in the lens as possible. But, doing audio only, it's been weird, but, the alternative was just shutting down the show. And
for sure.
As I've gotten across to people, I'd be dead without it. So it's really important to have this. So But the other weird thing is, when I record remotely, I take notes on the fly. And I don't do that in person, really. I mean, I'll write little things down, but in person, the guest is going to notice if you're not looking at them. So remotely, I write so much in the way of notes. I don't have to do any editing afterwards. Like I'll make notes for, okay, at the 52-minute mark, there was a static thing or something happened, but I don't have to play the whole thing back and, write down notes for the preview and all this stuff because I did it on the fly. Plus I can goof around on the internet because, that's what everybody's doing during these things anyway. I can't believe what they said on Twitter about me. Sorry, go on.
Well, actually I did not like Zoom or video as a replacement for the social interaction we started to miss. But it is true that for business meetings, I will always use a camera. You get totally different engagement than you do on the phone, especially with very busy type A personalities. It makes a huge difference.
When it's group calls, you can also see who's talking. It changes the dynamic of the voice where people are jumping over each other this way. Okay, we could see each other. I can give and take a little bit. But with audio only, I have to figure out the person's vocal rhythms on the fly without the visual cues. And it's a much different experience. But I think, again, I've managed to deliver really good conversations for the 5 listeners I have. I mean, 10 listeners that I have.
Did you find, I really liked the way you got back into it by doing just short segments.
The COVID
how
check-ins?
you're dealing, how you're dealing with that was a really good, nice way to sort of ease in. But have you noticed anything about your interviewing style or anything about the kind of things that you like to talk about, or any difference in the way you go about this task now, other than obviously the way you can take notes or the specific technical limitations? But
the big thing is that I can always, if there's ever a lag in the conversation, I can ask, "How was your pandemic?"
Right.
And that just, people will start talking about that part of things. If there's anything that's, we're kind of flagging here or there, you can drop that in and it's even better than what are you reading? And it's, during the early days of the pandemic, when I was doing those daily 20 to 30 minute ones, I did 60 of them in 65 days. I still have no idea how. But, we were all nuts at that point. And at least just being able to talk and share an experience and then share that experience with, potentially the rest of the world. I would get messages from people who loved getting those episodes every day because it just, it let them know that other people were going through craziness, that they were all trying to cope and deal and nobody was having a great time of it. And, as quote unquote productive as it seems for me to record a half-hour conversation, do no editing and just, post it the next morning, we were all fried and frazzled. That was just my way of being able to deal with it. And I wouldn't say make sense of it, but, try to make some sort of connection and some way of coping.
And connect it back to something like the reality that existed before the world ended.
We like to think,
too. I know you've talked about the change in your health status that fortunately isn't urgent, but it's kind of always out there in a distant way, and you're as prepared for it as you can be. Has that experience, is there anything about that experience that has changed the way you read, or more importantly, changed the reading of something that you had, changed the meaning of something that you've read or had time with?
Well, by sheer coincidence, although it's not a coincidence, I just read Dying, a memoir by Corey Taylor yesterday, which was her memoir of death. I have a stack of these. Chris Hitchens' Mortality, Oliver Sacks' Gratitude, Jenny Diskey's book, I'm blanking on the title, When Breath Becomes Air. I've got books by the dying, because I'm kind of interested now. And it's, there are things that I look at differently. For anyone who has no idea what we're talking about, I got diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia in late June. And, let's see, not, it's treatable, not curable, probably not going to kill me, something I'll die with rather than die of. Could take years and years before I have any issues with it. But, it's there, and my body's now a time bomb in a way that it, it wasn't previously. I mean, we all know mortality, but this was, for me, the first real instance of that in my life. I've been very lucky in terms of, my parents are both alive. I haven't had to deal with death particularly. And it changed me in a bunch of ways. I read books like that periodically now. I'm more sensitive to people's loss, of their loved ones. I'm more sensitive, I think, to age, I suppose. I was never callous about other people's losses, but, this is something that I see more clearly now simply because it's something in my foreground. Yeah.
This is the kind of thing you think until it actually happens. Then you realize.
Yeah, I mean, a neurotic Jew, so death obsessed in one way, but not with that as a reality. It's very different this way. And again, probably not going to be a thing. I'll find out 1 month from today as my next blood work. Probably not a big deal, but I talked about it in an earlier episode with a friend of mine who had done some Buddhist work, and being told by the oncologist, there is no cause outside of random mutation. There is no cure, and nothing you do can affect the progression. For someone who's a micromanaging control freak, it was a really weird thing for me to recognize that all this time I was trying to keep some sort of control. My hands were never really on the wheel. And my pal, who's no longer Buddhist, but had, enough training in that discipline, said, the real enlightenment is when you understand there is no wheel. And that's, the next stage I have to get to is that understanding of the self and the soul and what really exists, in terms of what control is, I suppose, what fate is, given that there's no real reason outside of I was born where I was born, I lived the life that I led, no proximal cause for anything like this. So yeah, it's been a little weird. Yeah.
This is a moment that people who have children say they've learned really quickly that the amount of control they thought they had over everything just is an illusion, just does not exist. And sometimes people say it's a really, really good thing. A lot of parents. Yeah,
in my case, it's been weird. One of my friends was concerned that was going to lead me on a sort of nihilistic approach, that if there's no cause, no cure, no, ability to affect things, will I go off the rails and just do whatever? It's like, no, I still have that Germanic / Jewish sense of responsibility and guilt about everything. So, I'm still going to, lead the best life I can. But there is that sense of what you do and don't do and what matters and doesn't. I'll say the first thing, in the days before I got the good diagnosis, which I call the best bad news, I unsubscribed to so many emails that I was getting. I deleted bookmarks. I unsubscribed from a shit ton of things. I didn't buy anything but food and art supplies for the first couple of months, because all of those things, in that instance before you know what the diagnosis is, and you think you've got 6 months left because, that's me. Yeah, all these things are ephemeral. I may as well just remove them as distractions. And, over time, distractions start creeping back in. I don't know if that's good or, if that's a sign that I'm sort of back in denial about the time bomb, et cetera. And how much are any of us in denial about it?
Right. And it's a matter of degree. There are things that can help soothe or distract in positive ways. And the same things, if you get lost in them and fail to be in contact with your own life, they're no longer distractions. They're now impediments of some kind. I think I remember you saying your oncologist said, if I have to say the words leukemia in an appointment like this, this is the kind of thing I want to. This is the exact.
Yeah. She said you've got the best kind. And every healthcare related person I've spoken to said, "Oh my God, CLL, that's great." As opposed to anything else you could have been diagnosed with, this is the good one. The downside is it also makes me more susceptible to all the other ones. So, there's that to look forward to. So.
But it's very much on your radar. You're getting looks at it, and if another one crops up, it's going to crop up in the cycle of your regular checks.
So you'd think
they're looking for that. So I was also wondering if, something that you have a long history with, something about that reflects the stage of life that somebody's in, or something you have a connection with that you've had to rethink, that you've discovered you have a different relationship with, the way people are supposed to have a different relationship with Lear as they get older. That you can't understand Lear in some way when you're 20 and when you get to be 50.
Yeah, well, there's a work of art I always hearken to. I tell people how thankful I am that I read The Leopard at 40 something instead of 30 something. Mm-hmm. Because until I was really middle-aged, I would not have gotten what the prince is going through in that novel. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things I would have said, oh yeah, poor guy. Oh, his kids are, not going to get married, and, the Republic's going to show up. You start getting older and you realize, and it's the same thing with this diagnosis. You realize what people have to lose. And I think that's the Lear thing too. It's that understanding not just of the technical drama of it, but the heart that, that says, these are my daughters and why don't they love me? It's not having kids. It's a different world for me in terms of trying to understand what you value and what you leave behind. But yeah, there are artworks and books that have changed in value and significance for me over the years. Mm-hmm. Nothing jumps to mind right now with, post-diagnosis. But, I've talked about this before, how the Iliad, over 3 or 4 readings, every, 8 to 10 years, changes. How Achilles finally became real for me when I realized he had a son, and that he was never going to see him again, and knew that he was never going to see him again. And the only way he could is if he doesn't become the center of the poem that you're reading. That struck me the last time. And that was maybe 10 years ago. I don't know what the book would bring me this time around.
There's very little that I can think of from my reading of it, which is much longer ago now, that's the first thing I can think of that makes him like anybody else standing next to him. You know what I mean? I've always felt him separate. I've always felt him,
and a temperamental douchebag and everything else. And then you realize he's got a son, he's got a father. I mean, I also have a secondary meta reading of the Iliad where he's the only one who understands fate and the rest of them don't. And that isolates him even farther. But for all that, he's still connected. And then you see in the Odyssey, he's in the underworld and he now knows, it's not worth it. Being the center of the Iliad wasn't worth it. You'd rather just get another 20 or 30 years with your family.
Has your reading of the Iliad actually changed now that you're having literal Achilles problems? Out of curiosity?
I wish. I think I'm going to reread it if my Achilles keeps giving me this soreness. I'm going to be pretty pissed off at Achilles and the whole tendon thing. But
there has to be some advice in there.
Yeah, you'd think. Outside of not getting struck by a spear, I can't think of it.
That's the one thing we know will not help treat an Achilles problem. I was actually going to shift to this because I heard you mention this week that somebody had sent you a copy of Murakami's what I talk about when I talk about running. And
I never read Murakami at all.
Yeah,
and so one of the guys in my running group gave it to me because he knows I'm quote unquote the book guy, which they don't call me professor, so that's good. Considering one of the other guys has a PhD. But anyway, go on.
But I couldn't unfortunately remember as I thought to ask the question whether or not it had arrived and is on the 2022 slate.
Yeah. There's a shelf from Design Without Brains or Design Within Reach, whatever you call it, this standing shelf next to my desk that is books for upcoming podcasts and my own, non-podcast reading. And it is, it's right up there. I could tell you what it's next to, like Renoir, My Father, and a couple of Stephen Heller books. But anyway, there's a whole stack of it, but it's right up there for 2022.
It's a remarkable book. I've read a fair amount of Murakami on the fiction side, of course, but it is actually, I think, a reasonable introduction to what Murakami's about. Obviously, it's not as surreal as some of the writing he does, but it gets you to I think it does introduce you well to his voice in a very real way. So I think it'd be a great experience. Cool. The other thing,
if I can get back to running, I'll be even happier. But go on. Yeah.
Well, and it may, for all I know, it may may scratch a little bit of that itch. I mean, not the physical endorphin itch, but it may give you some of the peace you're used to having out there when you're banging the pavement. I hear you. You said you had a guest for Thanksgiving, and I know he'd been a podcast guest a while ago.
Yeah, we had a David Bayerwald, the former musician, songwriter, etc., who I tracked down years ago for a podcast out in Brentwood, in LA. Lives out east now, so he was here at the last Thanksgiving before the pandemic, and we felt safe enough to have people over this year. So he and a friend of mine from college both came over, and just the four of us. He brought his guitar, which was nice too. So just played a little for us, and then we just traded stories. Well, he told a lot of stories about, decades in the recording industry and being around musicians. That was pretty entertaining.
Are there areas, it reminds me, I know you've done several with musicians. Are there any areas outside of what we think of as the traditional world of letters or the world of drawings that you'd like to expand into as far as your guest palette goes?
The thing I'm always curious about, I talked about name dropping. I talked about it with Clive James. Actors, not actors who write, but just actors. And I have no idea whether they'd be any good or whether they'd just be kind of in persona. And I asked Clive James once, because I said, you've recorded, you've interviewed a lot of people, pure actors. He's like, they're beautiful vessels and we shouldn't expect anything more. I was like, okay, that's pretty much what I was going with. But, I wanted to make sure that's where we were coming from. That said, when I did one a couple of months ago with the dramaturg at Lincoln Center Theater, Ann Cattaneo, her book on dramaturgy really goes into some of the creative choices and what actors bring to certain roles. I still don't know how well that would translate into conversation exactly. So, it's something I'm curious about, but, don't know if it's worth pursuing, as opposed to like a Richard E. Grant, who great actor, but also a good writer and, somebody who can talk through that sort of stuff.
Exactly who I was thinking of.
Yeah. I pitched on Twitter. We corresponded a little bit a few years ago, but it never came to fruition because I'm just some schlub from New Jersey, as I characterize myself.
Well, did you tell him how you feel about Hudson Hawk? I mean, that.
Oh yeah, obviously one of my three favorite movies of all time, which I did not tell David Thompson, the great film critic who I'm recording with next month. When we were getting set up, I was going to tell him, my three favorite movies, and then realized, the Hudson Hawk thing would probably not go over well. So I'm just going to avoid, any mention of that. So,
Well, unfortunately, the cat's out of the bag now, it sounds like to me. I personally loved the discussion you had with Aunt Caneo, I thought was tremendous. And I thought it was also an excellent introductory lecture to theater, period. I thought her overview of the history of theater was just incredibly illuminating. I could tell that you learned a lot.
Yeah, that was exactly the sort of book and conversation where I went in with, I don't know anything about this field, and I want to learn I want this person to tell me what they can. And sometimes, it's the same thing I tell people in the pharma space. There's no dumb questions because there's stuff that is incredibly intrinsic to that field. And, it might seem it might be nonsensical to an outsider. And the only reason we do it this way is blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I went into that one with, boy, I'm looking forward to just finding out who this person is, what this job consists of, and how you approach theater. So yeah, I was ecstatic to get to do that one.
What other older examples, throughout the history of the podcast have been like that as far as a learning experience goes for you?
It varies. I mean, sometimes it's just sitting down with artists, cartoonists especially, and illustrators who, seeing them and getting them to sort of talk through how they develop and how they work. But generally it has to be, something outside of my space. I'll say one thing, it's nonfiction, people who have a nonfiction work to discuss, at least as the peg for the episode. It's easier than people who have a novel because the conversation around a novel will almost invariably turn into, where do you get your ideas? And that's really, a go nowhere sort of thing. So, with the nonfiction thing, it's, how did you get interested in this topic? And then what did you learn, et cetera? You can start building from that. So yeah, there's more of that vibe. I think the translators I get to record with, they're endlessly fascinating. Yes. And, it still boggles my mind, but one of the most downloaded episodes of all time remains the Anthea Bell episode. I still don't get it, but that one, Clive James and Harold Bloom are the top three. I'm like, sure, whatever. People want to hear Anthea Bell talk about translation. I'm good with that.
I always figured it came up as an outgrowth of the Asterix. I assume there was some web search could make that somehow one of the results in there roped this podcast episode in.
The greatest thing I've learned about this show is I can never guess what episodes anyone is going to care about, which I give up even trying. There are ones that I've had with relatively popular subjects who I think this is going to be huge. They go pretty much average. And then ones that seem as though they would be pretty esoteric and obscure, turns out, it's in the upper 25% of shows. I'll say another factor of dying, we'll put that in quotes. I used to look at the web stats like daily, if not more than daily for the show. I don't anymore. I stopped that. The only time I see the stats are once a week when I log into the podcast site to upload the new show. And then I was I still do keep a spreadsheet of, month by month numbers. But now I just update it once a week when I put up a new episode. I don't go checking it, and just looking and seeing what numbers are like. That's been a change. There's a number of things along that same line that I don't care anymore. The only numbers that matter are my white blood cell count and, how well I'm running. The only two things I'm going to really concern myself with. So yeah, it's things like that on a really functional level. Once you start stripping away the things you were using to distract yourself and you're stuck with what's left. That's been, my last 5+ months, or 6 months now, just trying to see, what really matters. And then what you start reinventing again to distract yourself with. You could say the podcast itself is a distraction, but, it's also the purpose of my life.
Yeah. I've definitely gotten that sense that, it's like it's cliche to compare it to children, but this is a thing that you've built, and this is a thing that lives, and a thing that people have relationships with. That's the sort of thing that keeps one anchored to the world.
The listener thing is always weird to me, knowing that it's one thing to get an email from a listener, which is always great. Somebody just wrote a couple of weeks ago about something. They discovered the show this summer and they've been going back through the archives, and it's pretty neat. When I was once at an event at the Society of Illustrators, talking to the person who was doing a signing, and the person behind me says, "Excuse me, are you Gil Roth?" Like, yes. He's like, "Oh, I recognize your voice from the podcast." That was one of the weirdest moments I have ever had in my life. It's one thing to say, I listen to your show. To know my voice from that is really kind of one of those, okay, that's audience building.
That's a thing that happens. So that's
yeah. And again, it's a different thing. The other joke I tell about the Society of Illustrators is the time that we were there for Drew Friedman's Old Jewish Comedians gallery opening, where they had all of his paintings from his Old Jewish Comedian series and a lot of his memorabilia for it. I got there pretty early because I was coming in from New Jersey, had to try to skip traffic. So it's just a few of us inside the society. A couple of people start trickling in, and one of the people helping organize the party comes into us and says, "Drew, I think Joe Franklin is outside, but he's not coming in." Drew says, "Don't worry. Joe's not going to come in until somebody recognizes him." And that's literally what happened. Someone had to go out there and say, "Excuse me, are you Joe Franklin?" To which he says, No, I'm sorry. No autographs. And hurries into the society. So yeah, that's dumb New York celebrity stuff, but that's how it works.
He can't go in until someone's chasing him.
Yes. Oh, no. I'm afraid no autographs. I can't do that. Yeah. That's yeah. Anyway.
You have, I think, a huge advantage having, had direct conversations and been in the working spaces of so many visual artists of various kinds. And I know you've, I think as part of an outgrowth of this, how your year has gone, I know you've started engaging in visual art yourself. So there's definitely, I would definitely want to know how the relationships you formed through the podcast and even the exercise of doing the podcast, specifically the conversations that you've had, has opened the door for beginning to experiment in the visual arts now.
It's been weird. Like, I started drawing almost a year ago because I saw one episode of this TV show by John Lurie on HBO called Painting with John. And I just felt like I'm going to go draw something. Tomorrow I'm going to pick up a pencil and notepad, which is also a Society of Illustrators story. I was going there once for sketch night because Joe Chardello and Barry Blitt were playing in the band, the little jazz trio that plays at the Society sketch night. And so I figured I'd go see the guys, and I grabbed a sketch pad and a pencil over at the Artist League on the way up so that I could fake it. Like I could go in and people would think I was an artist, but I was actually just there to see Joe and Barry and hang out. And I never actually opened the pencil or anything out of the little holder in the entire time I was there. But anyway, that was my thing. So after watching Painting with John, the next day found that stuff from a year or two earlier, went outside, drew a couple of trees as though I was somebody who was just getting over a stroke or traumatic brain injury. And then even then it took me a week or so to say, no, I need to do another drawing and another one. And then after a few weeks, it was, I need to do this every single day, starting with trees and then whatever else came up, and got better. I was posting them every day just to keep myself accountable, putting them on like Instagram and Twitter. But after a while, when they started getting better, some of my illustrator and cartoonist pals started mentioning, oh, hey, you're figuring out this or that. That's really good. Like they were starting to see that I was, making improvement, which made me feel a lot better, just about doing this stuff. But it was just last week that this really nice moment happened when I posted this, Matador and Bull ink drawing that I had done based on Death in the Afternoon by Hemingway, which I started reading because of David Thompson's new book and blah, blah, blah. But the cartoonist Ho-Che Anderson left a comment on Instagram, which one of the advantages of remote is that I can open up these things while talking to someone, where he wrote, "Gil, I had no idea you were an artist, man. That's a lovely piece. I'm glad I discovered this was you." And I was like, wow, Ho doesn't really owe me anything. We've only recorded once. We had a couple of little email exchanges, and he thought that was art. Okay, I actually feel a little, something there, as opposed to anyone I know who compliments my stuff, which I assume is, them lying to me. But in this case, I was like, wow, Ho's a worse artist than I thought if he thinks I'm good. I'm just kidding. Yeah, Ho's a good artist, and he actually thought my stuff was okay. So it's kind of neat having that and being able to just ask cartoonist and illustrator pals of mine, how do you do this? Or, what brush are you using when you got that effect? And, being able to figure out a little of that. Like I watch on Instagram, John Cuneo posts videos in process of him drawing and painting stuff. And in the past, I would watch it just sort of agog. Now I'm like, oh, I see. Like I see why you just use this little dash of a line, and that's all you need in this spot and that spot. You don't need to make everything this photorealistic thing. So yeah, that's been, just having those guys as resources, but also, having them just say, that looks really good, or, hey, you should try this, or, go read this guy's book. It'll probably help you. I haven't read any of those books yet, but I do have them on that same shelf for sometime next year. But
also, when you started out, I know you were trying to be pure, I guess is the wrong phrase, but you were trying not to clutter it up with other, with expectations and with, focusing too much on technique. You just wanted to immerse yourself in it and see what happened. But so I think it's appropriate time to start reading those now.
Yeah. It was just literally at the beginning. It was just, I want to learn how to see trees, just see like what the light is on them and how they do what they do and what you try to render to make them suggest a tree. And that took a while. And then the leaves started coming in. So I had to start figuring out color. And then, things went downhill from there, and I had to go into watercolors. But even then, though, like it's something I've talked about with cartoonists and illustrators, live drawing like that, I don't think about anything else. When I'm drawing from screen, it's a little different. I do think more. Other thoughts, non-drawing related, intrude. But if I'm sitting outside drawing something from life, I'm just in that. I'm conscious of what I'm doing, but I'm not hearing any of the other voices. I'm not planning a podcast or arguing about generic drug user fee amendments or anything like that. So
you're outside of yourself.
Yeah, or you just one of my guests talked about like that being the real mindfulness. Like all this, all these apps and everything, that's bullshit. It's really, being focused on the thing that you're doing, not, sitting down and, tuning out everything in the world, but, being in something in that moment. So yeah, there's that, so now that the leaves are gone again, before it gets too cold, I'm hoping to sit outside and draw some of the trees in the backyard again and see how they've changed from the way I drew them last year.
Yeah, if you've never been up to Gil's house, there's no shortage of trees. There's a beautiful area of almost in the woods, considering how close you live to.
Oh yeah, they're about
City.
15 feet away from me is just the forsythia, and then hundreds of yards of woods behind the house. So, as I discovered this morning when I got up and saw that everything was covered with an inch of snow, and thought, wow, I don't remember that supposed to happen, but whatever, it happened. And went for my 5 a.m. walk around the yard down to the road, and a deer came bursting out next to me while I was walking by, and it was a morning of surprises, I'll put it that way. But
what you said about being able to turn directly to an artist and say, I've noticed this thing, how does that actually, what does that actually mean you did? How did you do that? It reminds me of the process that I go through when I'm trying to make music. I have listened to so much more music than I have played music, that often it's simply, and I think similarly with you, having consumed so much of this kind of visual art, without actually engaging in it, that for me, it's sometimes just attaching the names to things that I've heard, kind of making them discrete and making them separate and real in front of me. That allows. I feel like that might be the same kind of knowledge you're getting.
Oh, definitely. There are things that I see now that, if you just hint with this line, the viewer's going to get it. The person's going to see what it is. One of my great pieces took me weeks to finish. It was just the face of the boxer at rest statue, the Roman / Greek statue. And I was deathly afraid of inking the bruises, not the bruises, the lumps of the guy's face, because I'd done them in pencil, and, everything else I'd already inked and gone over part of it with a brush and given it these sort of lustrous shadows and things. But for the lumpiness of the face, I'm like, I think really, really thin lines, but I'm not sure how that's going to look. And the moment I do this, there's no going back, because I work on paper. I don't do digital with ink like this. There's no, whiting it out after for me. One of the things I was telling a cartoonist pal of mine a couple of weeks ago, that I'm in love with destruction at this point. Like I love the fact that I have to commit to a line and there's just no going back. And for someone who has such issue with, especially with writing, it had always been like this for me, that fear of doing anything wrong. The fact that with drawing, it's like, fuck this. It's on the paper now, and I'm just going to go forward and keep going with this and just try not to put in too many lines. I joke that drawing was a pastiche of Frank Miller, Jack Kirby, and then George Perez when I did the little thin lines for the lumpiness of the face. Because that, and these are the three great comics influences among the three great ones of my childhood. But even in doing that, I had that moment of, oh, that's why Perez used to do this. Okay, now I get, why certain inkers would make Perez's work look terrible, because their line was too thick. And this is, not that I'm ever going to get around to making real comics, but, there was just this sense of learning through doing with that sort of stuff.
Yes.
It's still, I'm terrible with light, terrible with proportions and all this other stuff, but I just did a drawing today that well, it was a watercolor that required maybe 6 different techniques and tricks I had to figure out on the fly while doing it, when it was something that I couldn't throw out, that had to be right the first time. And it was just like, well, that brush is too dark. I'm going to have to figure out something else now that I've already used it, and did ultimately. It's a thing I sent you. But yeah, it's that realization that, other people have done this stuff. You could ask them, but yeah, you can also just play around and figure stuff out for yourself. And,
and also that's, writing, music, art, any kind of art. You find those are moments you start to find your voice, where now you have something in mind. Now you have something you want to realize, and you have to figure out how to get where you are technically to there. I feel like that's
yeah. For me, I just don't know. Sometimes I think this is a blind to keep me from writing, which is the thing I'm supposed to be doing, and blah blah blah. That visual art making gives me an excuse. Well, we can't expect Gil to be very good. I mean, he just started doing this at 50. He's going to be okay with some stuff and a disaster with other stuff. That, like everything else in my life, it's a built-in excuse to not have to try as hard. Although I do try really hard with some of this stuff. There are days I don't put in my contact lenses because I need to be really close to the paper to do. I'm wearing my glasses today, in fact, for that reason. That I need to see something really fine and work on it, instead of, with the contacts, I can't do really heavy detailed stuff.
Right.
But yes, I'm always submarining myself and making excuses for why things are, why anything I do is not a significant achievement.
For me, it's funny you talking about not working in digital. For me, in the old days when we were messing around with this stuff, anytime I penciled something, everything I did that worked was so precious to me. I couldn't ink anything. I couldn't take.
I don't use pencils anymore.
Ever.
Like today I did, but I almost stopped using pencils now. I just go straight to ink. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But I've gotten much more confident with drawing a line. And that's part of when I got to meet Ed Sorel and record with him, there were things he was flipping through a sketchbook of mine that I had in my bag, and that's really good. And that blew my head off. But at the same time, there were things where I saw, this is actually a little Sorel thing where I just worked with ink and built stuff up, and you didn't have to be photorealistic. You got across what you got across. So you're just seeing that stuff and becoming more confident with it has been nice. I did a drawing of Joan Didion yesterday. She died yesterday. Yes. For those people listening in weird time zones. That's horrible because it's incredibly sketchy. It was in a little sketchbook, which I use for things that I know are not going to be great, just because I wanted to try to figure out the shape of her face, glasses, mouth, etc. And there's just way too many lines. Everything is too scratchy. And I thought when I finished up, I'm like, it's fine, but the point of being Joan Didion is that you don't see all the scratchiness. You'll see all the lines of age, but that's different than, the line itself being, scratchy and tentative. So at some point I want to rework that or work on that in a way that has a stronger, bolder line to it. But it's weird knowing that now, given that, again, about 11 months ago, I'd never picked up a pencil really. So, seeing that, this is what I want to achieve. I just have to figure out how to do it or how to fake it. So,
and I feel like what I was getting to I feel like you must have a storehouse of kind of passive knowledge gain. Like the example of how you can learn to read French for your graduate comps without actually being able to speak it. That you have an input. You've taken in so much. And
you're using the figurative you here because I have no knowledge of French whatsoever.
Yes. No. I meant that kind of knowledge that's going only in one direction. Right. That you've soaked up so much from this kind of from looking at people's lines without examining the lines themselves necessarily, but that you can go back and fill that stuff in.
That's almost 50 years of reading comics and again seeing really good artists, working guys like Eddie Campbell, who again I've been blessed enough to get to meet and correspond with. sitting down with Dave McKean and then seeing him drawing something and then later realizing he was drawing me. It was really fucking weird, but it was one of those, holy shit, that's Dave McKean actually just drawing right in front of me. He doesn't transcend to some like higher plane of existence when he's doing this. Right. He actually sits at a table and takes out a pen and draws.
Just like
years after
else.
that. Yeah. It took me years after that to actually do the same thing. But it's, that realization that, you have to do the work. And something I'm sure I've talked about on the show, but it's that realization also that nothing is perfect the first time. And with writing, this kills me,
Yes.
but with art, I'm okay with it. But, the example I use, it was some Elvis Costello outtake that I heard of Beyond Belief. The Land of Give and Take was the original or the title for that one. And I was like, oh, it's a different version. He was trying something. It's not as good as what the final version was. He wasn't perfect. And the same thing when you hear like Beatles outtakes. It's like, oh,
sure.
They had to work on that to become what they became. And we know that intellectually, but once you get that in your heart, that it's like, oh yeah, it's okay to fuck up. Just don't let it discourage you. Keep going and figure out, how to make it better or what went wrong with it and how to improve. I did 3 sketches of the thing I drew today. On crappy paper. I just want to figure out the shape, some of the stuff I was putting on it, et cetera. And then it was like, okay, I feel good enough about this. I'm going to go start drawing this for real. Cause once I put this on the watercolor paper, I've got to go and get this thing, drawn, colored, et cetera. And then hope to God I didn't screw up the eyes, the mouth, the, every element of it. But, you sort of learn what works and what sequence to go in sometimes, like with bird drawings. And we're spending all this time discussing drawing instead of the podcast, but whatever. Because it's the end of the year. No one's listening. It's fine. Or it's my show. Nobody's listening. It's fine. With bird drawings, I've discovered once you do the eye, almost everything else just falls into place right after that. One of my past guests, Caleb Crane, takes all these wonderful photos out in Prospect Park or when he's traveling. Really good camera, gets pictures of birds all the time. And I see them and just figure out which ones I'd like to draw. And I'll usually start with the beak and the shape of the head. And then I place the eye and then like the entire body falls out of that. And it's like, oh, that's what happens. You get that eyeball and the rest of a bird is there. So
waiting to happen.
Yeah. It's weird discovering that, or at least finding, some of those things that work. You're not wanting to make those tricks. That's the thing is still for me every day. I want to sit down and draw something, but I don't want to just keep doing, oh, I can do this, variations of this again and again and again.
Right. Right. This is a technical achievement.
Yeah.
Not an artistic drive at that point.
It's part of why I stopped posting every day. I had this, and this ties into the not looking at the podcast figures too. I would post something every day, and then in the evening I would look on Twitter and Instagram repetitively to see if anybody saw it and liked it. And that's a big chunk of everything that's wrong with modern
social
society. But that put me in the position of I should only post these once a week. And especially with Twitter, I make everything a single thread. I just posted this week's. It's Christmas Eve. No one is going to see it. It's great. I put it up there. There's no expectation that anyone's going to see these pictures. With Instagram, the algorithm just messes with you and puts different stuff, here and there. But still, that notion of not audience building, but just likes. It's still death to me. It's something that came up in a podcast with John Porcellino years ago, one of the I think, greatest cartoonists of our time, who said when he started doing King Cat, you just mailed out your zine in the mail. And 3 or 4 months later, maybe somebody would write you, and maybe it was Chester Brown or somebody who sends you a postcard about how much they like your thing. And that's great. And now it's, email was one acceleration, and then it becomes, you put it on Twitter or Instagram and you're just counting likes right away instead of let's slow things down and, just produce something and let it find an audience or not, or let people discover this whole archive of 500 episodes of conversation with people, many of whom they've never heard of.
Yeah. And that's the likes. They're Morse code. They're not, they're just a a blip. They're just
well, they can be the dopamine hit. Also,
yes,
for
exactly.
artists,
that's why they work so well that way.
But the big thing for artists is, what do they tell you outside of keep doing this?
Mm-hmm.
You got likes, therefore you should do something like this that gets you more likes.
Right.
And that's,
it's a different kind of achievement now.
Yeah. I'd like to say kids today don't make good art, but whatever. That's because I'm an asshole. I'm an old man. But, yeah, it's weird though. That sense of reinforcement versus, we're going to either self-publish or Fantagraphics or Drawn and Quarterly going to publish my book. And, for a long time after this, people are going to write, or I'm going to hear from people, or I'm going to see them at festivals. It's a different thing when it's this instant feedback
mm-hmm.
that doesn't
Absolutely.
mean anything.
Absolutely.
Even I'll say, even when I started the dying memoirs thing, I posted on Twitter, request anyone have books written by people who are dying, a la Christopher Hitchens' Mortality, Corey Taylor's Dying a Memoir. And people started suggesting things like Joan Didion's Your Magical Thinking and stuff like that. And I was like, no, that's stuff by the survivors. You didn't read the one fucking thing I asked for, which was books by dying people. That's all I want are books by people who are dying. And I don't, because other people can read the survivor ones. I'm concerned with what the people were writing when they knew they were on the way out.
Right.
That was a basic thing, but everybody's just reading so quick and just glancing at things. And what does it mean? What's it mean to like something? So yeah, it's weird. Again, you and I are old, in internet time, where there's a sense of, I make stuff, again, we're making a conversation that's already approaching the 1 hour mark and we haven't gotten anywhere. And, no offense or anything, but drawing, you had to ask about drawing. But that sense of, letting things breathe, mm-hmm. I got a magazine the other day. It's called Ink, INQUE. Stephen Heller, the great graphic designer, mentioned it on his Daily Heller blog, which is already a concession to the time-based make content every single day thing. But this is an oversized, big, square-bound magazine that's going to come out annually for 10 years and then stop after the 10th year if the world still exists. No online presence outside of being able to order stuff. Like, none of the contents of it will be printed online, all original material. And it's like, he mentioned this with shipping and everything else from England. It was over $90. I was like, I don't care. I will buy that in a fucking heartbeat, because anyone who will make that commitment, the 10-year
right.
thing, whatever, who knows what's going to happen. Right. But the idea that they said, we want an interestingly designed, gorgeous magazine with great writing from interesting people, and we don't want it to be online. You're going to have to sit and read this big physical object. I'm like, I'm on board. I'll do this. I'll support that. And I will, order it in a second. There's no built-in market for that. I always joke that those things have bigger comp lists than they do, paying subscribers. But still, it showed up yesterday, and it's sitting on my desk now, and I'm like, yeah, I'll start reading this, and just bits and pieces. I'll start going through, and it's absolutely gorgeous to look at, because I trust Stephen. I saw Stephen's thing about it, and I said that he knows what he's talking about. He's describing it in interesting enough terms. He interviewed one of the publishers of it. Like, I'm sold. Now, again, I'm in a unique position in terms of being able to afford stuff like this. But at the same time, I don't spend money on anything else. So
right.
I don't drink, smoke, or have any other fun habits. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
And you're consuming an artistic act, again, which is a thing I think we've kind of lost in a broader sense. And actually, I feel like we're sort of talking around. People who don't know us don't know that whenever we're talking, we're actually talking about writing anyway, no matter what it sounds like we're talking about at the top. But I got into this drawing idea because I think we've ended up talking around a particular theme, which is putting in the miles. Yeah. And because I was precious with the visual, with anything I put on paper originally, I couldn't put in the miles, and now I can.
Well, I was the same way, and it's part of why I never made a second issue of the zine. I put out a zine in the beginning of early 2020, Haiku for Business Travelers. I wanted to do a second one. I got a couple of pieces, one of which is a 2-page spread about how I make coffee, which is I made a PDF and sent this to people because it's fucking awesome, and completely useful, literally down to the second as to what you pour and how much and what second you cut off. But, it's once I started drawing, that changed my relationship to writing somewhat. I write in a journal every morning pretty much. I've only missed a couple of days over the last few years. Nothing super profound generally, but it's after the morning coffee and ice on my knees because I run. I go downstairs and write for a page or two in this little journal. And it was one of the ironies of getting cancer was that I had just ordered another year's worth of journals from the French company that ships this stuff. There's a whole series of the great ironies of Gil having leukemia. But that was one of the big ones. Like, really? I just ordered a year's worth of those things from Calipino the other day, but okay, whatever. I'll get by. Can't return them, But yeah, it's that sense of being too precious with your own stuff. And you and I are both a couple of neurotics.
Yes.
We're afraid that the mark we leave behind is the wrong one. And it always causes that fear of committing to something, or that fear of, just putting the lines on paper, or whether it's text or musical notes or whatever it's going to be. I don't know when I got over it exactly. And with writing, it's still there. I haven't even started a couple of things I've got ideas for just because, fuck it. I could spend the time drawing, running, making the podcast. Those are things that give me fulfillment. I'm not necessarily supposed to be a writer in capitals. I'm certainly not going to start, a writing career in quotes. That's one thing the podcast has taught me is that no writers have careers.
Right.
That it's not a way to make a living. And
not anymore. Absolutely.
Yeah. That's one of the many things that Joan Didion's death, among others we've experienced in recent years, people whose lives and careers don't exist anymore. Like you couldn't make a living doing the things she was doing if you're doing them nowadays. And that's been, an object lesson of the podcast to me was, thank God I did not pursue a life in the arts. You get doomed for things that are totally out of your control. And we see it with the pandemic. I've got friends who this is the book, this is the thing they spent 5 years on, and it was supposed to come out in March of 2020. Things got moved, delayed, publicists quit, 2 weeks before a book comes out. Too many things are not under your control. And again, as we've said, there is no wheel. Nothing is in control, but I still just wouldn't feel, I don't even want to say comfortable, just putting all that time and effort into something that would rely on outside validation, I guess, in a different way than just making the art and putting the joke is I do put the art online every single day pretty much, except I put it on Flickr because I know nobody uses Flickr. Nobody's ever going to go to that site and see it. People are like, oh, I want to see more of your art. I'm like, it's right there. You just, you have to go find your Yahoo password and eventually you can get in. But, it's weird. But yeah, that sense of, being willing to make the line on the paper, I guess, is
I worry that we've been a little too dismissive in certain ways. I'm dismissive, a little too hard on mean about the way social media can support artistic intent. I mean, obviously, you have to get past the dopamine drip of instant feedback, but there are times I think when I talk about putting in the miles, for instance, that the discipline of posting every day. Oh yeah. Even if you're driven, the thing that's fueling that could be the dots and dashes of the likes. But that got you to put in the miles. That got you to just start scratching and get unprecious.
Definitely. And doing the show also, it's the one thing when people ask me, how do you start a podcast? How did you do it? What do you do? I tell them, first year plus, I just kind of did them whenever I could do them. Don't do that. I said, give yourself a schedule. A pal of mine is the same thing. She was doing an email and it was sporadic. And it wasn't a marketing thing. It was just her writing. I told her, put a little note at the bottom saying, if you're interested in more of my writing, go here. So that there's a call to action of some kind. I know you're not selling something, but you have a website. You've got your work. You want people to know and go there. I said, and second, do it every single week. Just have one day of the week that is when it comes out, and do that. Because if it's whenever, it's whenever. It becomes whenever for you. It becomes whenever for the reader. They don't care. Just make it a regular thing. And I bust my ass to get the show out on Tuesdays. Sometimes I'll put it up early. There's, weird occasions where it's had to go up a day or so late, but I do that on Tuesdays. I try and get the email out on Wednesdays, and that's, the routine helps. I find it ties back to one of my funnier, stupid stories of when I met or bumped into Graydon Carter, the former editor of Vanity Fair, in the Ottawa airport when we were headed back to Newark, and our flight back was delayed, and he was leaving Vanity Fair at that point, and we shot the breeze a little bit. He actually was the guy who convinced me to keep going to get Ed Sorel, who had turned me down previously. I said, don't worry. I never thought Ed would finish the murals in my restaurant, but he finally did. Just keep pushing him. Eventually you'll get him. And it worked out. But he was leaving Vanity Fair, and we talked a bit, but I didn't think of this at the time. And I emailed him after. I never heard back, but I said to him, or wrote to him, you're leaving. I know you have all of these other projects. You've got your production company, you've got the restaurants, you've got other things, but you have pretty much gone without a break from Vanity Fair, Spy, the New York Observer, etc., since the early 80s at this point. So that's like 25 plus years or 30 years of going and going and going, and having a periodical that comes out. And I said, it might be weird for you when that first month goes by and there are no page proofs. And there's no, because I went through this. I left my magazine in 2014 to launch a trade association, and discovered there's no deliverable. I ended up creating a weekly e-newsletter for my trade association just so I would have something to do every week on a Friday. The newsletter had to come out, because otherwise, it was Gil, you have a giant open-ended project now to negotiate the generic drug user fees and do all this other stuff, but there's no recurring thing. So, I told him, I know I'm not teaching you anything. You're Graydon Carter. You've had this incredible career. I just think you might discover that things are a little weird afterwards. Well, 6 months after he retired, he launched Airmail, which is a weekly e-newsletter that comes out that's basically Vanity Fair as an e-version. So, I assume he already had that planned, but it was clear he had to keep that cycle going, has to keep, editing and having something to produce. But I find it incredibly useful to have that. And, simultaneously, I'll say simultaneously, not to let missing a deadline kill you. There are times that, I didn't do it, therefore I'm now a failure and there's no point in doing the next one. It's I can't get a show together this week. I will, apologize to everyone and just put up a good show next week. Or the email, same thing. I just can't get it out Wednesday because there's way too much day job work to do. I will put this out a day or two later. No one will hold it against you. And that was one of my big things, because I assume you live the same way, where you figure there's a recording angel who's watching everything. And as I once started a short story that I'll never finish. In my youth, I thought the recording angel was going to tell me how many quarters I had blown on video games. And as an adult, how much time I'd wasted with porn. But, somewhere in between, that's where the life gets lived.
And my recording angel is in my skull. So.
Yeah, that's all it is. It's just telling you.
Forth with him.
Yeah, you spent this much time on this and this much on that. And it's just like, okay, but these are the things that, are giving you some sort of meaning, and putting yourself under undue pressure to do it is not great. But to me, not giving yourself a deadline, a repetitive function, or at least a recurring thing, for me, that's the best way to do this stuff. Sometimes I can't draw in a day. Usually I'll sit at the dining room table and work on drawings. If I don't have it, I'll bring the sketch pad over while Amy and I are watching TV. Maybe I'll start scribbling something. Maybe I won't do anything. It doesn't kill me now to not do that, because I know it's all right. I'm just not in the mood. I'll have time. This isn't a profession. I'm not a cartoonist who has to turn out, X number of pages. But yeah, it's the repetitive or the recurring thing I find is good for creative practice. But again, everybody's mileage may vary and people have different circumstances.
And because I think as trite as it may sound, there's not drawing and there's not drawing.
Yeah.
You know, it's never picking up the sketchpad as a different act than encountering the sketchpad and saying, or encountering the typewriter, you know, or, and it may be, the thing I was thinking about when we were talking about the influence of social media, especially, and we talked a little, you mentioned something about writers specifically. You know, a lot of art is so solitary, though, you know, the process of making it, the process of doing it. And I have to imagine for some artists, the connection to people, and not just in the sense of the ability to reach out to someone to ask them a question or the factual, but things to fill your engine in. You know, if we take the metaphor of you know, you bring in, and then when you're full, you create art to get it out of you in a certain way. And I wonder if the ability to be connected to people and have your world be bigger, isn't beneficial, to writers. Have you?
Well, it can be, sure. Yeah. To me, it's you know, it's, well, there's the empty calories aspect of it. You know, there's the sense, again, what I get sitting down in person with someone, you know, you're experiencing each other for an hour or so, and you're not looking at screens, and you're not mediating, and you're not adjusting, you're not rewriting a text to make sure you're getting across exactly what you mean to say, or not not misleading, or, you know, whatever vagueness you're trying to get across. You know, it's good. It's just, to me, you know, it's not quite the same as meeting people in person. You know, that sense of real life. The joke I tell, and you know, it's when I first pitched Chris Ware, we were introduced at Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, and I said to him, you know, I'd love to record a conversation with you. He's like, well, I'm in Chicago. Do you do these remotely? I said, no, it's in person. It's two people sitting at a table across from each other for an hour, not looking at screens. And I joked that the smile was just getting bigger and bigger on his face, like with Cliff Clavin on Jeopardy in that episode of Cheers in the second round, when every subject was, you know, basically about Cliff. And then you see this grin just getting bigger and bigger. But yeah, that was just that moment where Ware was like, yeah, okay, we're just going to sit down like two human beings. That's a lot different than, you know, talking into the ether and worrying about, you know, what are they hearing? What are they thinking? You know, are they looking at something online? But yeah.
I mean, there's a flip side to that for me, though, because, you know, I visualize being a writer, and through the eyes of the writers that I know, so much of the interaction outside of your immediate circle happens in this very constrained environment, you know, readings and you know, at events where you're a thing. And, I feel like that there's great potential in, you know, in there being a middle ground, where you can actually get to know. I mean, the artists that I correspond with and have connections to in social media, it's not like running into them outside of a show. It's not, you know, it's more one way. But you know, there are different opportunities for interaction. I got a chance to, there's a great band that I love out of New Zealand, and they were locked up. They were quarantined in the middle of working on their album. They had to all stay home, and he pulled out an old Casio MT keyboard, and sampled all of the tinny, awful percussion sounds.
Yeah.
And put them up on his Patreon as like a sampled instrument. Like they were all organized, and there's a technique called multi-sampling where you lay a series of very similar samples at different volume levels. And when you play them hard, they're loud. When you play them soft, they're soft. And which of course the original keyboard did not do. It had no velocity sensitivity whatsoever, but, he sent that out on the Patreon, posted just as a funny little project he did. And he had not done a version in the DAW that I work in. And so I reached out to him and was like, would you want somebody to do a version of this in Ableton too? And when I did it, I felt like I'm being so ingratiating and so like, oh, am I just one of those fanboys who thinks they found a way in and is going to try to, you know, is now going to get a chance to peek through the keyhole. And he didn't answer for a few days. And I actually got really anxious about it. And then I got a message from him on my Patreon saying, I was hoping somebody would say that.
Good.
And we went back and forth just a little bit. And it's not that I know him better, but I ended up feeling really good about it because I did something nice for someone that I know is really nice.
Yeah.
There was a level of personal feeling and interaction that would never have been an opportunity for.
Yeah. I mean, the thing you got to understand, though, I have paranoid schizophrenia, and as such, I don't believe any of you are real if I haven't met you in person. That's my thing. My assumption is bought until proven otherwise. So that's kind of been an issue for me in a lot of respects. Okay, not that bad, but it is a lurking concern on my part as to, I know it'll sound, old man like, but until I see you in person, until we, I look you in the eye, how real are you? How real am I?
Yeah.
We've joked about how, I know my depression is bad when that's a day that I think I would fail a Turing test, but that's, thank you. That's, nonetheless part of the vibe that, it's, especially with the show, the initial points of connection with people whose work I've idolized, and then discovering like, oh, their email address is just their first and last name at Gmail. Okay. And it's just like, oh, you're a normal human being. And suddenly having okay, we'll sit down and talk, and you're just a normal guy or gal, because, I'm an old man. Sitting down, especially with musicians, sitting down with Beowulf, sitting down with Laurie Carson, somebody whose work I've adored for years and years, and just sitting and having a conversation. It was like, oh, you're a person, and, it's great talking with you and learning, about writing, about, what you do when you're not making music, and, what this life is like. Where, doing that by text or by, Facebook connections and things like that, just to me doesn't carry the same weight. It's good. It's just not they're virtual memories, I guess. They're there, but they're not quite, real.
Clever way to work in the plug.
Oh yeah, I've been using that ever since Windows 95. When they came up with virtual memory, I've been using that metaphor this whole time. But
that's very nice. That's good. Be interesting, but also be a good marketer. Always be closing. Yeah. I think, and something I remember from the the Laurie Carson conversation stayed with me. The notion of being a lifer.
Yeah.
And
to that point in her career, she had always made her money from music somehow.
Right.
And that was my, holy shit, you've done that. Like,
right.
And I get this talking with Beowulf. It's the same thing. It's like, he couldn't record for a bunch of years. So he wrote music for people and ends up winning an Oscar and becoming, having a great career as a songwriter for people and developing other work, but always staying in this space and making his living that way. Yeah.
I feel like what I've had come into focus for me during this conversation is that when you talked about the zine, for instance, we talked about certain examples, knowing the thing that you're writing to, in the sense of I am doing this so I can put a zine out, wasn't sustainable. It didn't sustain anything for you. And when I look at artists that I know intuitively are lifers, that they will continue to do this no matter what, it feels to me that the second you stop being able to make money out of it, the drive is there, or it isn't in a pure sense, that it lives outside of you and your daily temporal existence. It doesn't need to have a known end product when it starts. It's just a river that keeps running, it seems to me.
Yeah. Yeah. With the zine, my whole thing was just give it away. Some people, including you, sent money, but it was just like, I have a day job. The same thing is up on Twitter recently, where Brian Eno blew up the whole NFT, the non-fungible token thing, in a really entertaining way. And I
of course he did.
He just blew it up. It's like, great. Yeah, so now artists can be, tech bro assholes. Fantastic. Great achievement.
Right. That's what we all aspire to.
Yeah. He said, if I wanted to make giant amounts of money, I wouldn't have gone into music the way I did.
Right.
But I said, people used to ask me, how are you going to monetize the podcast? A, I'd burst out laughing, but B, basically the podcast is how I demonetize my life. It's not in terms of I'm spending down all the money. It's just this is what I do that has no monetary value whatsoever. There's nothing to it. Anything I get on Patreon, I immediately turn around and donate to other artists. There's no quote unquote profit from that. Everything is given away.
It's the way you clean yourself of the handling of money. It's the way you insulate yourself against.
It's just the sense of having something that you do for love.
Yes.
And, and never having a thought of, this is the thing that'll break through. My great moment of affirmation or validation last year, in 2020, came when I recorded a remote one with Kurt Anderson, Graydon Carter's partner on Spy all those years ago.
Yes, yes.
And we finished up and Kurt said something like, "You're really good at this." And I had that moment of, holy fuck, Kurt Anderson, who ran the show on WNYC, who had the talk show all those years. He thinks I'm good. At no point did I think that means I can quit my job and go do this full time somewhere, because that doesn't exist, not in any way that would support me. But the idea that I built that skill up, as you mentioned, again, going back through the reps, doing this, repeatedly and learning how to talk to people and how to listen to people, which I'm not doing a great job of this time because you're interviewing me. And also not putting all these asides in when I'm talking to normal people because they can't keep up with this insane prattle from me. You're figuring that stuff out and learning that's been, part of the achievement.
Right.
And, I'll say on one level, and I've talked about this, it's made me better professionally because I can now get up in front of any number of people and just speak when I need to, because I'm used to doing this. Which I didn't, it was something that actually hit me in 2014 when I was at a public meeting with, 2014 when I was at a public meeting with FDA and they were having an open comment that I didn't know I was going to be speaking at and realized I needed to get up there and speak and thought, I've never done this before. What am I going to do? And I had a couple of notes. I took a breath at the podium. I looked down at the microphone in front of me. I looked at the microphone in front of the FDA guy and I thought, Gil, you do this every goddamn week. You sit down with somebody you've never met. There just happen to be 150 people behind you expecting to hear something about generic drugs, but, go. But beyond that, on a human level, what the show has done for me in terms, not just in the, thank God I didn't pursue a life in the arts, but the sense of listening, just sitting down and listening to someone, not waiting for them to stop talking, which is what most conversation is, really letting things go. I say, sometimes it's unpredictable. Weird shit comes up. I've cited it before, but the moment when I was sitting with Bill Griffith, the guy who makes Zippy the Pinhead, for the first time we recorded, and I asked him if the strip is autobiographical in any sense, if it's sort of coded in a way that he knows who he was, if he looks back at strips from like 1994 or something like that. And he paused and he said, I've suffered from depression on and off for years. And I was like, I have no idea where the fuck this is going. And I am not going to cut him off. I'm not going to say anything. This man wants to talk about this. And maybe it's connected to the question I just asked. Maybe it's not, but this is his time to open up about something. And he did. And we had a really good conversation around that. When we met a few years later, he told me one of the funniest things I've ever heard, which I'll tell here because, again, nobody's listening. We were recording in a hotel. And I take photos of most of my guests afterwards and was taking his picture and there was artwork on the wall behind him in the hotel. So I went to move it off the wall so I could just get the wallpaper, but it was bolted on. And he said, yeah, that's a real problem with hotel artwork nowadays. You know what I used to do, Gil? No, Bill, what did you used to do? Well, I used to take the hotel, if it was like a city scene or something, I would take the hotel artwork off the wall, take it out of the frame, and I would draw a little zippy and cut it out and put it into the piece of art, like fitting into wherever the cityscape was. And then I'd put the whole thing back together, put it back up on the wall and leave, hoping that someday someone looking at this Paris street scene in a hotel room in, Alabama or something, said, why is there a pinhead and a moo walking down the street over there?
That's so him.
Yeah, that was my moment of like,
I never met him, but
if you were going to create something for Bill Griffith to do, that would be
exactly.
it. Yeah, that was my moment of, okay, that's easily the funniest thing any cartoonist has told me about traveling life.
That's so. I remember after you interviewed Roz Chast, and I asked how she was, and you said she's exactly what you hoped she'd be.
Yeah.
And that's the same kind of moment with Bill Griffith.
Yeah. When I took a picture of Roz and she looked like a Roz Chast drawing because she just had this little jolting of anxious energy in the moment I took the
picture. The wild little curls on the hair.
Everything was just that moment of you're Roz Chast. You've lived up to being Roz Chast. But yeah, that moment with Griffith. But the one earlier when he just started talking about his mental health, I was like, okay, let's Just sit. I'm going to sit and listen because I don't know you. You've never met me before. I've driven up to Connecticut. And that day of all days, I drove maybe 4 hours up to his place, recorded, drove to Stonington to record with Sandy McClatchy, the great poet who died a few years ago, and then drove home. And in the middle of the day, I was thinking, what the hell am I spending my entire fucking weekend doing this thing for? There's no money and this is no glory. There's nothing that's going to come from this. But I had that conversation with Bill, and I had a wonderful conversation with Sandy, who again took ill soon after and stopped doing press of any kind. And we had this wonderful moment where he was adapting my favorite novel into an opera, The Leopard. And he described the end of the first act. And I just got chills sitting there while he was walking me through this. And it was just tremendous. And I'm driving home thinking, that's why you do this, Gil.
Yes.
You got to sit down with one of the greatest cartoonists of all time, and then this great poet and librettist. And you got to experience this because you went out and called them and said, hey, I'd love to sit down with you for a little while. So, yeah.
When we know from comics, when a writer runs out of ideas, they inevitably turn back and recycle the origin story and re-examine that. And it seemed to me what I was starting to get to with this notion of not having an end not starting out with only the end in mind is, if I remember correctly, you didn't set out to say, oh, I really need to make a podcast. How would I do it? This was an extension of a thing you were doing. When you went back for homecoming, you were looking forward to sitting down with particular tutors and having a conversation. And whenever,
our whole thing about going to St. John's was, the conversation is everything. And, I'd started doing the show, but only because I'd listened to Mark Maron's WTF podcast and thought, oh, I know some interesting people. I would love to start doing this too. Just have these conversations, see what happens. And then the cascade effect, you start getting, more and more guests who like the experience, turn on, other people or tell you about other people you need to record with. You learn to name drop, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, to me, the function is still, I understand for artists, their time is limited. They want to make sure it's tied to something they're going to sell. But I also enjoy, again, sitting down with tutors of mine from St. John's who there's nothing to be sold. There's just a conversation about, one of the things I'm finding interesting is I'm entering the 10th year of the show, and I've had a number of repeat guests over the years, and I'll be recording with one another week or so. One of the first people I'd recorded with, Wallace Wilde Manozzi, this great writer and translator. And the notion of change, it's something I always ask about, like, how has your field changed? How has your approach to your work changed? But now, seeing them over the course of years and re-recording and seeing how the years have treated them and how their approaches have changed, how they've become different people or become the same or, intensified, what they do or what they've learned to focus on. To me, that's fascinating, and that's why, as much as I love, meeting someone new, there's always that sense of, it's great when you catch up with a past guest and just sit down and we know each other. We can get through the obvious stuff and then really sit down and try and gauge, what the years have done, how things have gone for us. So when I saw she had a new book coming out, I was like, well, that's an excuse enough to meet with Wallace. Last time we recorded, I took such a weird route home. I ended up passing the White Castle on Route 59 in Nanuet, New York, and had to stop. Now in the pandemic, I will just be, driving in a giant bubble straight back to home as fast as I can. But at the time it was, I guess I'm here. I'd better stop and abuse myself terribly like this.
Yes, I'm going to live forever. I should have some White Castle. So.
Therefore, yeah.
But my sense is, knowing you, my sense is, obviously, I think the sense of people who hear how you interview and how you have conversations, the conversations would be happening anyway.
Yeah.
You decided to point them through a podcast, but this was something you were going to be doing no matter what.
Yeah. I mean, I would have, if I didn't have the show, I still would have, for example, in 2012, sat down with David Townsend, sat down with Tom May and had conversations. Having the show, you talk differently as you see preparing for this, you looked at questions that would make sense to an audience as opposed to you and me talking about NBA jams in 1994. Boom shakalaka. That's should we have taken, Larry Johnson and Alonzo Mourning instead of, Ewing and Oakley? But that sense of getting to talk to someone and, give it some sort of shape where we have this sort of thing. All of that said, there's so much conversation that goes on afterwards. With guests, whether or not I know them. Like with Ed Sorel, we talked for an hour or two after we were done because, he was friendly and I figured, when am I going to sit down with Ed Sorel again? Right. He's 92 years old. He put this off a couple of years before. Let's just keep gabbing for a while. He doesn't seem to be pissed off that I'm in his house. So, which you also have to watch out for. There's that sense of like, oh God, okay, I'm overstaying my welcome. Right. Do I, right. With the remote recording, it's a little different. But it's I love learning about people's lives, and the show has helped me fine tune my ability to do that, to get rid of some of my extraneous stuff, to offer up enough of myself that they don't feel it's an interrogation. I always tell people it's a conversation, not an interview. Right. Very few people get that. Very few people understand they can start asking me something. And when that happens, it's usually fun. Depends on, chemistry and the mood, etc. But, it's that sense of, you just want to, I have this curiosity about people and what comes out in conversation. So the show is sort of a natural thing for me to do, but it also gives a shape and gives an impetus because I can also fall into deep periods of inertia / anxiety / depression that, having the show makes me, well, I have to do this because of my 10 listeners. I have to go out there and make something.
I've definitely heard guests that I think you're probably going to cut after that. I think it would be smart. But I've definitely seen that there are guests who never get over the interview moment, that you can hear they're trying to figure out how to keep this being an interview because that's what they know. Oh, yeah. But then there are episodes like with Haywood Gould that
he's just this guy who wanted to talk. Exactly. And we had a great conversation. We followed up around the guest list episode that I do at the end of every year, where I hit up that year's guests and ask them, what was the favorite thing you read last year? What are you hoping to read next year?
Yes.
And so we reconnected for that. And that of all things, like he told me, I've got a whole bunch of sales of the book right after we recorded, and they all told me, I heard you on this guy's podcast. His book sounds great. I want to read it. I'm like, holy shit, I actually do have an ability to sway people.
An influence on the universe.
Yeah, go figure. But yeah, sometimes, they also told me, the publicist told me before we got together that, he's had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma for 20 years. He's working on a cancer memoir. I'm like, well, of all coincidences, I've got cancer too. And so that, gave us another area for conversation. But he is somebody I never would have thought of, never would have heard of. And a publicist said, he's got this memoir. It's really entertaining. You want to sit down and talk to this guy. I know the sort of people you talk to, Gil. You should meet Haywood. And I'm ecstatic that I have. That's led to, I hope, a future one with Pete Hamill's brother, who is a photographer he has a book out in the last year or so of all of his pictures of John and Yoko. But he's been a celebrity photographer for decades. And he left a comment on the Haywood Gould episode. So I followed up. I'm like, are you in New York and interested? He said, yeah, I had a book out last year. Let's get together sometime. I'm like, well, that's how this works. So I want to find out. And the story I always tell is the time I got set up with Ben Modell, who plays accompaniment to silent movies. And that a guy turned me on to and just said, you've got to record my friend Ben, because he plays accompaniment to silent movies. I'm like, holy shit, that's exactly who I need to record with. How did you know? Because I want to find out, not just how did you discover this is your thing? How are you making a living doing that? And now during the pandemic, when he was one of the guys I did the check-ins with, he started doing a regular appearance, a regular YouTube thing where he and a guy play a silent movie and he does the accompaniment and they do some commentary before and after. And this just, opened up a new audience to him. And he'd always held off on doing this sort of thing because it was much more about doing these in-person appearances in different theaters around the world. now it's turned into, holy crap, there's actually an audience that cares about this and a whole following. You can build up on it.
Right. And people who never knew this was a thing that existed, people who never knew,
like me. I mean, I'm sitting there with David Leopold and he says, my pal, plays along to silent movies. I'm like, how? What does he do? Where? I gotta find it. How does he live on the Upper West Side? This makes no sense, And so that was how one of my favorite episodes ever got done. And that was
all my favorite episodes are like the Haywood Gould episode, because they're Eno-esque to me in that, for all I know, neither of you knew the mic had been turned on yet.
That's always my favorite line. When a guest says to me, I forgot we were recording.
Yes.
And this is, it's a pretty visible setup that I have.
Right.
When you can get the guest really comfortable and, they just feel like they're having a conversation with somebody, with a friendly person. And, I got this from certain guests over the years where I've had the, holy crap, I thought you would be much more uptight about things, and you just really got at ease and let it go. And that's why there's certain guests I also don't pursue, because I feel they're a little too media savvy and would be too, I'll just say it this way. People have said, have you ever recorded with Neil Gaiman? And I'm like, as much as I enjoy Neil's work and as much as a number of his books meant to me over the years, I feel that he is too good at, listen, my time is limited. I've got a couple of modules of stories I can tell. I'm going to do that. And, and it's understandable, because you can't expect them to have something new for you every single time.
Right.
I can force that out of some people. And I've done that in very funny ways, where I know a person's about to launch into a story and I short circuit them because they've told the story a million times. To me, that's funny. To them, it's infuriating. But what comes out of the infuriating thing is good conversation usually. So,
but I think it's a very real concern. Would you be talking, not that Neil Gaiman's a bad or superficial or, empty person, but you'd be talking to the Neil Gaiman construct, not the actual
the persona.
Neil Gaiman. Right, exactly.
And this is people like my brother's always, you got to record someday with Dylan. You got to try to get Springsteen. I'm like, those are guys who have stories built.
Yes.
They are going to tell their thing. I'll tell you a funny thing that Beierwald told us. He has a connection to Springsteen, and he was at a party with him once, and he's sitting down with David and he says, man, the thing about a good song is it's like a car where you can kind of do this. And he's telling David all this stuff. He's like, wow, that's really fascinating. Some really neat shit. And he goes to see Bruce a couple of days later performing. He does the entire exact monologue on stage. And David's sitting there like, wait, was he trying that out with me? Is that an old routine that he was doing on me? Did he think, oh, hey, that's interesting what I just said to David, I should use that? But I had the same thing with Clive James. After we finished recording, we walked a little bit in Cambridge while he kind of led me towards where I was going to record with his wife next. And he told a story about because at the time he was, because of his emphysema, he could not fly or travel anywhere. And I asked, where he missed going. And he said, I really miss going to the Strand, bookstore in New York, because one of the things I would do when I would go to the Strand, I would just end up buying about $2,000 worth of books and just having everything shipped back to Cambridge. And it would take a while. So like 6 to 8 weeks later, this boxes would show up with these books I didn't even remember buying. And it was like a present, everything that I wanted. And it was all here for me. And he tells me this, and I'm laughing at this wonderful idea. And I sent a picture from the Strand a couple of weeks later when I was in the city. And an essay collection of his comes out, I think, early next year. And that's in there as an anecdote in an essay. And I'm like, had he already written that? Was he workshopping it with me? Was it original with me? I don't know. But he made it seem really fresh and original. So maybe I do need to start recording with actors. I'm not really sure. Yeah. But yeah, that's my point though. Yeah, these guys have, I don't mean it in any disparaging way.
Yes.
But Bruce Springsteen is not going to try to be completely original for every single person he records with. Whereas Posey Simmons, when I sat down with her in the UK, she doesn't sit down for a lot of press and has never sat down with a weird guy like me showing up. we're going to generate some original conversation out of this. Things are going to arise as we talk that wouldn't necessarily occur with somebody who's got a big name, a big, popular media type career. I would love to sit down with Dylan anyway, just to talk about books and art. Steve Martin, same thing. I would love to talk art with him and not comedy. See if that would work. We do have a couple of mutual connections, but nothing I've ever tried to leverage. But at the same time, you just don't know how much they've already got, preformed, I guess.
Sure. Well, I think the general rule that, I know it's not a hard and fast rule, but you tend to start the idea of having a particular guest because they have a book. And I wonder if you restrict yourself to those people, this is not something they've done. The problem with being Bruce Springsteen is that you get asked the same question for 30 years. You get the same set of questions. That's one of the ways this thing calcifies into a media persona. But the guy had never written a book before, maybe, that you could meet him on a common ground.
To talk to Dylan about Chronicles and the books he mentions in Chronicles. That was my thing. The only in that I had was through, the ex-husband of an artist I recorded with, Mimi Gross.
I was going to ask.
Her ex-husband, not Mimi Pond, Mimi Gross.
Okay. Yes.
Although Mimi and Wayne White might also have a connection to Dylan now that I think about it, but I don't know how close I have a connection with them.
They might have a connection to anybody.
Reg, and in fact, this Dylan connection, the artist, I got to look up Mimi's husband's name, Reg Grooms, I think. Manhattan Ruckus was his big project. Anyway, Dylan cites him as one of the fine artists he liked the most. And I'd recorded, Red Grooms, that's the guy. And so in Chronicles, it comes up and I was like, well, I've recorded with Red's ex. If I found a way to record with Red, I could maybe leverage that into finding a way to get to Dylan. But again, what are you going to get out of that? What's Bob Dylan going to say to me that would somehow be different than, or comprehensible, in relation to anything? So, I stick to my lane. I go with, guys I know. Getting the interesting connection to Moby was fascinating to me because it's an art form I'm not used to in music, but I felt we could talk, and we had a good talk. But yeah, there's people who have a media thing or halo around them, I guess. It's just, to me, not as interesting. That said, Robert Caro is the guy I'd really love to sit down and record with, who has that sort of, world, but, might be able to have a good conversation with.
And if they have enough on the ball, you occasionally, see what makes some of the great late night hosts is that they can help them get past that. Sometimes you want to break from that. Sometimes it's refreshing when you're on the junket, when you're on the circuit, to not have to give the same answers and actually talk to somebody for a while and make some jokes.
Well, this had been my ongoing, until he died, whether I could get Philip Roth. And, I got contradictory takes from people who were close to him saying either he never would have done, people who I recorded with who said, no, Philip never would have done this, or Philip would have loved this. It would have been really good. Now, post his death, the biography, the deliberate shaping that he did of his persona, things that are coming up now as people start going through the letters and everything else, I realized never would have happened because he would have had to have been in control. In fact, this came up when I was recording with Robert McCrum this year. I asked, don't meet your heroes moments is the single, without missing a beat, the single worst interview experience I ever had was Philip Roth. He blurts that out instantly. I'm like, really? He's like, yeah. His people insisted on complete control over everything. I'm like, when I read your Philip Roth interview, it didn't sound comfortable. You did sound like you're making concessions. Like, I wish I could have expressed to the readers how unpleasant the entire experience was. I'm like, okay, that makes me feel better. That, it would have been nice, but somebody who was well respected, high up in his world, still had to do this kowtowing and, have a disastrous experience with him. So yeah, I don't feel as, I realize it never would have happened. So I don't miss the fact that I didn't get the opportunity.
I'm so glad. But you have to chisel him off of the guest Mount Rushmore.
It's still somebody I wish I had gotten to, but again, I understand now. There are certain people I was never going to get, and certain people I'm glad that I've got. And again, some of the best ones I've had are people who were not my Mount Rushmore, but were people who I've had. Again, going into it, was Ben Modell ever on my radar until David said, my friend who plays silent movies, and it's just there. Harold Bloom, on the other hand, I wanted to sit down with Bloom and have a conversation before he died, and managed to do that. And
maybe I got to find a way to get you down to Nashville and have you interview Robin Hitchcock. I will go to see him 100 more times. There's nobody I've been to see more, specifically because in between the songs, he just starts babbling in a really intelligent and interesting way. And I was reminded of this because I wanted to relearn a song of his, and I found some footage of him playing it on YouTube, and they had included the couple of minutes before he started talking, before he started playing, of him talking, and he was talking about Dylan, who he's a huge fan of. He says that one of the reasons he picked up a guitar was because of Dylan, but he's not like Dylan. He's a moist Englishman who doesn't put things out. He's not even like Morrissey. He says, I'm just not that kind of ranter. And then he thought to himself, actually, I guess Morrissey and Dylan are actually the same thing for their respective generations. They're these difficult, irascible God figures who look for every opportunity to drive their followers nuts.
Whose death will be more lamented in England, Morrissey or Weller?
Now Weller, no question. Now Weller. It turns out with the Morrissey thing, it's so scary. It turns out that
the longer it goes on, the worse it gets.
All the things we thought were double-edged in a kind of satirical way, no, he's taken all the air out of those. It's
well, that can also be, the lesson I've learned from certain older guests and older artistic friends of mine. The older you get, and I used to refer to it just in terms of sexual fetishes, but other parts of your life too. If you don't moderate, okay, we're talking about Samuel Delaney, but if you don't moderate certain aspects of your life, things will get more extreme as they go on. So that's an issue. And I think with someone like Morrissey, if you don't start toning down or opening up to other perspectives, you see this with John Cleese also. You get certain of these guys who are getting angrier and angrier as they get older. And then you get Eric Idle, who's on Twitter just having a fun time and open to new perspectives and happy that people know who he is. And it's one of those, and not to say that Twitter is the cause of that, but it's he's not going on about how we need to close the borders and make England great again or whatever you're going to do. It's time. The older we get, if we don't keep this sense of flexibility, I guess, or that brain plasticity or whatever you call it. Again, it's what the show does for me, just giving me other people's perspectives, giving me an hour or so of their lives, whether they're, old guests, even the young people I've recorded with, younger, under 35, which to me is, I had an inherent bias against them because A, they're productive at that age and I wasn't, and B, they haven't seen enough cycles of the world go by to really get some of what's what life really means. But I'm getting more from those sorts of conversations. You see things, there's some books I read that I'm like, I don't understand how people think the way they currently think, but clearly they do. So, we got to understand how perceptions are changing, the things people consider acceptable and not, it's different than how I grew up, but, trying to stand athwart and cry halt is not really the way forward.
You have to keep trying to make your world bigger. If I could describe a problem that we have, there are two kinds of people who don't want their world getting bigger, and people who do. And I think this any kind of endeavor like this podcast continues to keep you open in that way.
So since I derailed you from all the questions you were going to ask, what else are you going to ask?
No, I asked, I didn't come up with more than two really, because I figured it'd be like a seminar in that, you ask the opening question and we're off. And like
What is podcasting, and can it be taught? Yeah, that's always.
Is that a podcast under your cloak, or you just because the thing I first loved about seminar, and I was thinking about this when we were talking about the Bill Griffith moment, you just know it doesn't matter if it's more or less interesting. It's just if it's got legs, you know when something has legs, and that's what continues to get talked about in a reasonably functional seminar, and that it starts to take on its own momentum, and all that determines that is, in the terms of this conversation, does that idea have legs? And as an interviewer, I think you can recognize moments too where this thing has its momentum now, and that's how you get to conversation, I think, or one of the ways.
I mean, it's, and again, this is me, portraying myself as slightly on the spectrum. There is a degree to which writing up questions in advance and everything is my Asperger's-y way of building a conversation in advance. Having the conversation there so that, we can do this, and not that I'm in control of it, but at least that, there's some sort of framework in place.
Yeah.
And some shows I have almost nothing written down for, but, and I've heard this about comedians who are autistic or Asperger's, or on the spectrum at least, have said that, they like being on stage because it lets them control a conversation. Even if there's hecklers, they can control a conversation where they might have difficulty one-on-one. They're talking to a big room full of people, and they can just, I've got everything scripted out. I'm just going to say all these things and do my thing. So I occasionally, I'll have zingers, et cetera, written down, but, it's just let's start with a couple of questions, but, once somebody answers something, and I use Moby as an example again, because, we had a question about him selling his old vinyl and a lot of his old recording equipment. And, I knew I knew he was doing it to raise money for a vegan fund, but I was trying to get to understand why he didn't want to own those things anymore. And I kind of kept nudging him along. And finally, he opened up when he realized what I wanted to know. And that turned into this whole understanding of, what money meant to him, what getting the house of his dreams meant when the dreams came true. And it was like, this isn't what I wanted anymore. It revealed something about him as a human being and revealed character.
And it took,
I started with was, wow, why did you want to sell your old vinyl? And that was,
and it took you getting past his expectation of what interview is, which surely he's familiar with.
I fully expected assistant to show up 30 minutes in to say, "Oh, Moby, I'm so sorry, but you have to talk to someone from the label," that they'd had a built-in excuse to get rid of me. But we ended up spending like 75, 80 minutes. Wow. And it was just, okay, awesome. If you're cool with talking and you can't tell that I just had barbecue before coming here, this is great. So, which I admit was a little bit of a mind fuck on my part, but it is what I did. So.
Well, I write questions down for two reasons. I occasionally have to do this for, freelance article writing too. I'm terrified of blanking and not knowing what to say next when we come to a natural stop, and I need to move the conversation along with another step. But also, I hate ending a conversation or interview and having a pin in something in my head and say, "Oh, I never got back to that. I'm always meant to ask them this." And we were having such a good conversation. I never, I would be able to let that go too, but it keeps me from completely forgetting that this might be a really good question. So
when I say I write very little down when I'm doing in person, that's one of the things I write down. Like if there's something that I know that's a thread I want them to get to, if it's tied to a question I ask, I, circle or put a little star next to it, or I'll just write down a word quickly, because I want to make sure it's something we actually get to again. But it's, sometimes those moments are lost, but it's the nice thing about recording, at least you get the entirety. And I've done one of the changes over the years with the show is how little editing I do now outside of, there's a technical thing or a glitch here or there. I used to take out the pauses. I used to the ums and ahs. I'm like, you know what? That's the flow. That's how people are thinking while they're talking. Leave it in. It's okay. If anybody wants to skip through that stuff, they can play it at 125 or 150 or 2 times. They'll get through it.
Right.
Right. It's no big deal.
I have a strong self-deprecating suspicion that you may go back to editing today. This might be a good chance for you to try your chops again.
The flow of this has been fine. I've done way too much gabbing, but that's fine. Yesterday I talked to the people at Asper about pandemic preparation, so it's nice to
get out of
about
that.
myself in the podcast for a while.
Well, I as someone who's known you a long time, and
too long,
shared,
some would say.
Anybody who knows me has known me too long. But coming from a similar intellectual tradition, but also sharing some of the same, some of your Rushmore is the same as mine. I think we didn't know you'd have a podcast someday, but we partially built that list together. And to see what this has grown into and what it's done for you and the influence it's having in whatever way is just tremendous. I think
thanks, man.
I think it's a real achievement, and I hope it goes on for a very long time.
Thank you very much. I was putting together the calendar for next year and realized when the 10th anniversary episode or 10th anniversary of my first interview is going to show up, and B, episode number 500 is provided I don't have leukemia is going to show up middle of next year. And that was one of those things. I'm like, holy crap. I don't count the 60 COVID check-ins. Otherwise we'd have already hit 500. But because of course the recording angel counts those differently than the other ones, you understand, because we have OCD on top of all the other neuro issues we have.
I don't think that's OCD. That's reasonable. Yeah. That's reasonable. If you're going to have a number, number has to have rules around it. How do we make the numbers?
Of course. Because we're insane. But yeah, episode 500 will come up, and it's one of those like, goddamn. I mean, I went weekly. Yeah. I went weekly the same time I quit my job and launched the trade association. It was January 2014. I was like, I'm going to do the show weekly. That's my commitment from now on. And holy shit, I just quit my job and I'm about to dive into a completely new space and I don't know what the hell's going on. And missing an episode like that February, I think, caused me pain. One week, I was like, I just can't get in and do this one and do the editing and do everything. And I'm going to have to skip a week. And I then realized 50 episodes a year is just fine, Gil. No one's producing that. No one cares. It's okay. So thank you. But yeah,
you have to get there by trying to do weekly. As long as you schedule it weekly, you can move it. But if you don't have that recurrence,
like I was saying about the email and about this and everything, just whatever the form is, if it's something you make public, then make it a regular thing. If it's something you do privately, I like to think a routine helps, but again, everybody's mileage can vary. Everyone else has kids and we don't because we're us. Sure. But just
we're smart. That's why.
Yeah, see?
And I don't think we have Asperger's. I don't think we're on the spectrum except for the fact that we're smart. Anybody who's smart is automatically at one end of that spectrum through no symptom or no fault of their own. That's just how the world works.
I figure other people have far more significant issues. I do have moments where it's normal people wouldn't do this, but that's it. Who wants normal?
Right, exactly.
And that was me. Many thanks to Aaron Finkelstein, for taking on the interviewer role this time. I thought for a minute about making the Someone Interviews Gil thing an annual year-end episode, but then I realized, A, there aren't many people who'd be interested in that, either in terms of listening or interviewing. B, I'm just not that interesting. Plus, C, my sententiousness. But Aaron was a great sport and almost as self-deprecating as me about all this. And he is right. I did actually edit this one just to clean it up a little. Anyway, Aaron is not active on Twitter, and I have no idea if he's on Facebook, but he does post photos on Instagram sometimes as A.K. Finkelstein, all one word, which is A.K.F.I.N.K.E.L.S.T.E.I.N. I'll put a link to that in the show and episode notes for this one. Oh, and he's got a Bandcamp account with some of his music, but he did not send me the link to that, so when I get that, I'll share it with you. And you can support this podcast by telling other people about it and by writing me to tell me what you like and don't like about the show and who you'd like to hear me record with or what movie, TV show, book, music, theater, piece of art, whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by email, by postcard or letter. I always love postcards. Or by leaving me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That is, let's see, that goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about me picking up and getting stuck in a weird conversation. And messages can only be up to 3 minutes long. Otherwise, you have to call back and leave another one. Let me know when you leave a message if it's cool if I run that in a future episode of the show. I will never run one without the speaker's approval. But if you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. My day job treats me just fine. My expenses are pretty low. Really, if you've got money or resources or time, I hope you'll help support other people and institutions that are really in need. You can find individuals through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and other crowdfunding sources like that. And if you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, you can look to your local food bank, the Poor People's Campaign, Freedom Funds, election funds. There are a lot of things you can do to help work towards a better world. So I hope you will. And here's hoping for a good 2022. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.